Hello, my name is Håvard, the creator of LensSim. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can install the add-on, the basics of how it works, and its caveats. To install the add-on, we simply drag and drop our zip folder into the Blender viewport. Once installed, it should pop up here under the add-ons. We now got the LensSim panel in our 3D viewport. Right now I have this camera here that I want to convert, so I'm gonna convert to a LensSim camera. Once converted, it have tried to inherit some of the parameters of the camera, like the focus distance or focus object, the minimum clipping distance, and the f-stop. As you can see, we have our current lens here and its scale in the real world scale. This is the Canon 7 lens. We also can see the ray portal plane here. The way it works is that we shoot rays that hits this ray portal plane, and the ray portal plane is simulating the camera inside the material. The biggest caveat here is that we have this ray portal plane. Right now it's quite large, so if we want to scale it down, we can simply scale it down. And if we go into render view here in the camera, we can see that we have our lens. We can also see that the camera scale doesn't interfere with the rendered image. One thing to notice is that if we set this too low, we will at some point run into some floating point issues. Right now we're at the center of the world, but in general you should leave it a little bit higher. I want you to treat this as a real camera. So here we have the lens, for example, and this might be the size of the camera housing. If you leave this at 0.2, you should be fine in most cases. Another thing with the system is that we have to shoot rays from our camera to the ray portal plane. That means that every object in between this distance will be rendered. So if you have multiple LensSim cameras or object that's interfering inside this box here, it will interfere with our render. Another thing is that this is an orthographic camera. So if we change to solid mode here, we can see that our field of view is totally changed. To work around this issue, we can disable the lenses in the scene. This will convert it back to a standard Blender camera, as closely representing the LensSim camera as possible. So if we toggle between the LensSim camera and the disable camera, you can see that we get pretty close approximation of the LensSim camera. This is of course a little bit hard to calculate if there's lots of distortion to our image, especially with fisheye lenses. It's hard to get the right approximation. So just keep that in mind when disabling the lens. Another thing here is that we can work with the lens disabled, but we can enable it in the render. So if I now press F12, it will convert it to a LensSim camera and render with the LensSim camera, as you can see here. So like this, you can still work as a regular, but when you press F12, it will render as a LensSim camera. If you want to have multiple cameras in your scene, we can simply deselect our lens here, then create a new one. When rendering with the new lens, all LensSim cameras all other lens saving cameras will be invisible, as you can see here. The only issue is if that they're both intersecting. Then we can see the ray portal plane of the other camera. But as long as they're not intersecting, there won't be any issues. Right now we have this camera selected. If we deselect the camera, we'll lose it from our selection. If we want to pin the camera, we just press this button and it's pinned, so we don't lose it when we select other objects in the scene. Right here we can see our current lens. If we want to change one, we just pick and choose one. You can also search for lenses and mark it as a favorite, like this. Here we have our current sensor mode. Best fit is utilizing the biggest working area of this lens. If you choose focal length, it will mimic Blender's focal length. What's interesting about this is that if we choose another lens, it will still maintain the same focal length. And sensor width is of course just manual width of the sensor. Hi, this is me from the future. I've added this extra button here. If you want to shoot with portrait lenses, what you kind of want to do in real life is just to rotate the camera 90 degrees. It's a little bit inconvenient, so what we're going to do instead is to change our aspect ratio, and then we're going to press this button. This will actually rotate the camera in the shader. If we choose another lens here, for example the anamorphic camera, you can see that here it's not rotated, but if we press this button, it will be rotated. And another thing is that for anamorphic lenses, like this one, you can see that our circle of illumination here is quite wide. So the best fit size is just utilizing like a general area of the sensor, of the image that we get from this lens. But what we really want to do is to change the aspect ratio and then choose like a larger focal length of this lens to utilize the whole area of the image that we can get, like this. So I encourage you to just play around with the focal lengths, aspect ratios, and like these settings. I think you should do this with every lens, because again, this is just like a general system. Okay, back to the tutorial. I won't go through all the details here, but if you want some more info, you can simply press this question mark or hover over the buttons. I've had some issues, some technical issues with the description here, so that's why I've added these question marks. But on some of the buttons there will be some description, especially if there's not a question mark. One thing to say about focusing here is that it can easily be broken. Right now we have the size Tessar lens, and if we try to focus it real close, it will eventually break and give up. So this lens is just a standard lens used for maybe portrait photography, for example. So you won't really expect it to be able to focus at really close distances like this. And if we go into the render schematics here, we can also see the sensor position. So if we're focusing to infinity, the sensor position is here. And if we're moving the sensor, now the focusing position real close, you can see that it kind of exponentially shoots to the right. So at one point, the focusing system will break. So just like the camera, I want you to treat this as real lenses as well. The same thing if we increase the f-stop here to shrink down the aperture position. It will also break at a certain point, especially if we're trying to focus below the kind of working range of this camera. And these thresholds are individual for each camera. If we're shooting with a telephoto lens, for example, we can't really focus that close. This is capped to 3 meters, I think. If we look at this render schematics again, this lens is huge. So at infinity, we have the sensor position here, and at 3 meters, it's over here. So just like, you need to imagine how much can you move the real sensor to be able to focus. We have the same thing with the macro lenses here. This wide angle macro can focus really closely, because this lens is made to be focused real close. So this we can push really close without it breaking. 0.1, like 10 centimeters, is nearly in front of the lens. And if you're also try to focus at an object in between the lens here, it also won't work, because this is the closest distance that we're shooting the rays. So as long as you keep that in mind, work with the lens as an actual physical object, you should be fine in most cases. If we look at the advanced settings, we can see our camera and our lens data. Lens data is where we describe the lens. This will come in another tutorial. And the camera is our current camera. Here we have the object, for example. If we want to disable the lens view, we can do that. We can also control the lens mesh distance and set the clip start and clip end. With the clip start, we will still have to trace from the camera to the ray portal plane. Just keep that in mind. With the sensor here, we can add our own squeeze factor or add to the current squeeze factor. That's the same thing with focus. If we try to focus this anamorphic lenses too close, we might run into some squeezing problems. So if you want to override this, you might want to use one of these parameters. Under the aperture here, we can change the size of our aperture. This image represents the original aperture, more or less. Optimally, the image needs to kind of touch the edges of the square. If we choose an image like this, for example, it kind of loses a lot of rays here, because the image is quite small compared to the squared box here. Right here we have some color correction tools. Default, it's no color correction. If we take white color sum, it will sum up the RGB values to 1 and try to maintain the exposure of our image. Intensity sum will maintain the exposure, but it will remain the tint of our image. So since this image is blue, the result is also slightly blue. Here you can see another one. It's a little bit better to see. You can also rotate the shape and multiply the image to kind of color adjust it yourself. The gamma here is linked up to the color correction. So if that's on, it's a little bit sluggish on larger images. Here we have some settings for turning off the ray guiding and exposure compensation at higher f-stops. Here we have lens start. We have two types. Type number 1 will add an object in front of the lens that acts like the lens start. Change the contrast here of the image. You can see it a little bit more clearly. This object will be visible to other cameras. As you can see here, it both blocks light and scatters light. The scattering is a little bit easier to see if we add a point source here. So here we can see that the light interacts with our lens start. This is easier to see on sharper lenses, for example a wide angle lens. If we turn up the f-stop, I think on this setup we need to remove the clip start. Yeah. Since we converted our camera, the clip start was set to 0.1, which actually clips this object here. But here you can see that the light interacts with the dirt. Here again we can kind of change the contrast of the image. We have some mapping options for the texture, rotation. Here we can control the amount of light scattering happening, also the roughness of the effect. Here we can control the light block. This is a little bit easier to see with the whole scene. If we change the from min to map from max mapping, you can see it a little bit more clearly here. This will also contribute to the bokeh shape of our lens. If you look at this. This is a general system, so sometimes we kind of want to change the mesh distance or mesh scale if it doesn't quite work with the current lens. Changing the mesh distance will also make it a little bit sharper. Type number 2 here is nearly the same, but this only works in the shader. So here the lens dirt only blocks light, it doesn't scatter. We also have some color correction tools here to try to keep the same exposure of the image. The gamma is also linked to the color correction tool, so it's a little bit slow. Here you can see the effect that it has on the bokeh shape. Here we have a split diopter. We can add the two diopters and change the focal length of each diopter. This of course can also be broken, as you can see here, if it's too small. But here we can kind of have two focus positions in the lens at the same time. We can also offset the position, add another one on the left side, add some rotation to it, and offset the distance. Here we have tilt shift. That will actually tilt the sensor in the X and Y angle, no axis. You can also control the pivot and also shift the sensor. Under emulation effects, these aren't really realistic necessarily, but it allows for some interesting effects. Under Chromatic Aberration here, we can change the colors of the color spectrum when sampling in Chromatic Aberration. Here we have some bloom and glare mount. This isn't realistic at all. To only shift the image around a little bit on the samples to create some bloom and glare patterns. The difference between bloom and glare is that glare happens in a star pattern here. And bloom is completely round. Under distortion, we can add some distortion to our lens. Blur is just regular radial blur with an exponent fall off. Under anamorphic bokeh, we can change our lens into an anamorphic lens by changing the squeeze factor. Here we can also compensate, make the bokeh oval. We can also add some swirliness to our bokeh, make it swirl around the center of our image. Add extra depth of field if we want to do that. Under controversial, we can add focal length to our lens. The global scale scales the whole lens. So if this is set to a higher amount, the relative scene scale to the lens will be smaller, so it looks like a miniature object. The ray portal scale here will just scale the ray portal object, and a side effect of that is that we can change the size of our circle of illumination. One thing to note here is that most of these effects relies on the focusing being set at a distance. For example, focus empty, focus object, or distance. And the manual mode will break a lot of these effects. On an end note of this tutorial, I just want to say again that if you treat this camera as a real camera with the lens, you should be fine. But if you break or push values too far, they will eventually break. This isn't a perfect system, but all lenses should work within their working range. And one last thing, you can also break or extend some of these values here lower than intended. So here, for example, we can set the chromatic aberration to over 1 or -10 if you want to flip the sampling range. That's all I'm gonna cover for this video. If you want to learn how you can implement your own lenses, you can check the next tutorial. Thanks and bye.